Hey there, this is Dan. I'm the producer of the Rhodes Center podcast. If you like this show, we highly recommend you check out the Watson Institute's other podcast, Trending Globally. On it, you'll hear more in-depth conversations about politics and policy from some of the world's leading experts, including occasionally from our very own Mark Blythe. You can find it by subscribing to Trending Globally on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Again, that's Trending Globally. All right, on with the show. Thanks.
Hello and welcome to the Rhodes Centre podcast. My name is Mark Blythe. I'm the director of the Rhodes Centre for Economics and Finance at Brown University. I'm delighted to have on the podcast today Martin Sandbu. Martin is a journalist at the Financial Times. Martin does this wonderful service for everyone called Free Lunch, where basically he reads all the things that we don't have time to read and puts it in a newsletter and says, this is amazing, you should read this. So much of what I have generated has come from Martin. I can only say thank you for that. The fact that you're employed to do that is fantastic. You're like a research assistant for everyone. It's totally fantastic. He has a book which has just come out with Princeton University Press called The Economics of Belonging. It's an excellent book. I really recommend it to everyone. And I want to start off by congratulating him on the title, because I do good titles, right? Austerity, The History of a Dangerous Idea, most recently Angrynomics. But The Economics of Belonging is a wonderfully evocative title. But what do you exactly mean by that? And I'll set you up with one thing. Do you remember Theresa May?
Yes.
Citizen of nowhere?
Yes.
Right. So flip it. What's the economics of belonging, and how did we get from that to the citizen of nowhere?
It's a good setup because, in a sense, the opposite, right? She was talking about how the elite don't belong. My take on it is that it's actually the left behind, if you like, who don't belong. That the both political and economic problem we have in our societies and have had and been worried about before the pandemic arrived is that a large group of people don't feel, and rightly don't feel, that the economy is working for them, that it's not a national economy that they belong to, that they don't have a place in it. And I start the book by telling a pretty long history back to the Second World War. The first 3 decades, roughly, after the Second World War, you saw an extraordinary phenomenon across the West, Western Europe, North America. You saw a process of economic convergence along all kinds of dimensions. High paid and low paid, wages became more compressed, wealth levels became more compressed, unemployment and productivity increased, and regions within countries started growing together. The left behind lagging areas caught up with the richer cities. So you had convergence on all these dimensions, and it created an economy, and I think this is what people are often nostalgic for, an economy where everyone really could feel, I have a place here, there's a place for me, I belong to this. That ended in the late 70s, around 1980. And again, you see the same phenomenon across all Western countries of convergence either stagnating or even being thrown into reverse. Wage inequality increasing, wealth inequality increasing. In many countries, the share of national income shifting from labor incomes to capital incomes. And maybe most dramatically or politically importantly, the regional convergence ended and either stagnated or in some cases you had increased regional disparity within countries. So I call that the end of belonging. But it's the economics of belonging because it's really at the root an economic phenomenon.
Now, belonging in the sense of you've got something to contribute, your contributions to this are valued, and you are more than just a kind of factor input into the productive process. There's a citizenship claim that goes along with belonging as well, right?
There is, but I actually think the end of belonging is worse, and you might not even be a factor input into the economy in some cases.
So you're actually not needed anymore. That's the case.
You think high structural employment in Europe in the 80s, 90s, and of course a fall in labor participation in the US for the last 20 years, even before the recessions of 2008 and of this year. So it's even worse than what you say, right?
Yeah. Yeah, so it's actually, you're actively excluded from the economy. and your citizenship, if that rides on that in a sense of belonging, the two of them come apart at the one time. Now, many commentators who are out there have made a strong case for what we're seeing as the political reaction to this, the mistrust of elites, the populist explosion, particularly its right-wing version, as being very anti-establishment, anti-globalization, etc., as being primarily a cultural phenomena. Now, your book, along with mine, along with Jonathan Hopkins' Anti-System Politics, makes the case that you really have to start with the economics. And you make the strongest case, I think, for why is that's the case. So just unpack that for us. Why is this an economic problem and not a culture shift in that sense?
Well, it is, as you hint, it is both. It takes both forms. But I think economics is at the causal root of this. So let me give you a number of reasons. One is just kind of looking at the phenomenon of populism. It lines up really well with the economy. It does that in time. You see the first rise of anti-system populism in Europe in the 80s. At the same time as deindustrialization is really hitting, the loss of industrial jobs and the sort of status and community that went with those. But it's because of the jobs getting lost in the first place. That's an economic story. It started before globalization took off in earnest, or some people call it hyperglobalization. That really started in the 90s and especially the 2000s. But populism had started to be appealing already before that. It was in the 80s that many of these European parties, Front National, for example, burst onto the scene. So that's one thing. And the other thing is you look at what the populist anti-system disruptors, what they promise. What they promise is to a large extent an economic story. And of course, they also appeal to authoritarian and xenophobic and racist prejudices. But they have an economic story at the heart of their offering, which is, you got screwed by the system, so come with me, throw the whole system out, and we'll fix it for you. And that's why I think that even in the narrative and the rhetoric, it starts with, you got screwed in the economy, now let's throw everything out, and we will fix the economy too. There's a third reason, which is that if you look at the psychology literature and even really just everyday observation too, when you're under pressure economically, when resources are scarce, we tend to become more insular, more inward-looking, more tribal. You write about this in your book much more than I do in my book. But that too fits the story. Now, that doesn't mean culture doesn't matter. It doesn't mean you don't need a cultural rhetoric as well to explain this. But I think that if it's right that economic forces help this phenomenon increase and rise, then there's a good hope that fixing the economy can also fix some of the politics.
Yeah, this is exactly where I come down on it as well. I mean, my simple counterfactual on this is when real wages were rising from 95 to around 2001, all of this was in abeyance. All of this, there was nowhere to be seen. And as you also say in the book, what's the alternative? We all just line up into different tribes and have a big culture war? Is that how we're going to solve this? If you can't fix that, you can fix the economy. It's not clear that you can fix tribalism in that sense. Now, let's move on to the two main angles of attack that you take for explaining the end of belonging: technology and the rise of the knowledge economy. There's many other things in the book, but I want to just highlight those for a second. So the technology story, if I just give a very simple one and then you can riff off of it, is in a sense undeniable. So manufacturing output has been going through the roof while manufacturing employment has fallen. This is true within countries, across countries, and at a global level. This has begun to filter into the service sector through the algorithmic revolution and the digital revolution, the rise of more precarious forms of employment, platform employment, etc., etc. So there's the technology side. Now, just tee this up here. You're from Norway, the one technologically advanced, right on the frontier part of the world that hasn't sacrificed, if you will, its social contract, that hasn't abandoned an economy of belonging, are the Scandos. And yet they're as technologically advanced, open, globalized, and export dependent as everyone else. How did they manage not to screw up?
You're quite right. Let's just mention here that even the Scandis have problems, but it's all relative. Because I think it's important to just put on the table that you see the same economic process everywhere, and it's a question of how well countries have handled it. In the case of the Nordics, it's really worked because they've gone with the grain of technological change. So on the whole, they have not tried to hold on to the jobs of the past, nor have they allowed the jobs of the past to be replaced by new, poor, precarious jobs in the way that's happened, especially in the UK and the US, but also if you look closely in the dual labor markets of France, Italy, Spain, and so on. And it's often seen as a paradox. How do the Scandinavian countries manage to combine a high degree of equality with high productivity growth, efficient economies, and so on? It's paradoxical in the sense that it's surprising because we're trained to think of this as a trade-off. Actually, it's probably the relative egalitarianism that has helped the technological growth. And it works in a couple of ways. One is just through incentives. What caused wage compression in the Scandinavian countries was strong unions. I say elsewhere in the book that if you don't have strong unions, you can find policies that substitute for that. But the economic mechanism is through compressed wages. If the wages of the lowest paid are high, it's simply not viable for a business to rely on a business model that employs a lot of low productivity but low paid labor, because that low paid labor doesn't exist. So over time, either inside a business or between businesses or between sectors, you will have an incentive to shift from labor intensive but low productivity labor ways of doing things into highly automated ways of doing things. So you substitute capital for labor, to put it very simply. Now, that by itself isn't enough, right? Because that means some jobs disappear. And it's not well known, but the Scandinavian countries, Denmark and Sweden in particular, have very high rates of job churn. Jobs disappear there all the time. They have the highest rates in Europe of job-to-job moves within a quarter or within a year. Something like 25% of Danes shift jobs in a year, according to the statistics. But what they have in addition is that they have a set of policies that allow that transition from lower productivity to higher productivity jobs to happen. Part of that is pretty obvious. It's good education policy so that everyone, or as good as everyone, has these generalized transferable skills that allow you to learn a new way of doing things, or that allow you to start, using this new machine that the company has brought in to be able to pay higher wages. So fewer jobs, but better jobs. The other thing is that they've had a pretty active demand management apparatus in place so that they try to keep job growth high so that the new jobs that are better jobs are also plentiful enough to employ people. That's sort of roughly what I think of as the ingredients of the secret sauce.
So to jump to where I want to end up, but let's just do this now. Can you generalize that model? I mean, the usual critique mainly from the right is these are small, homogenous countries, there's high degrees of social trust, big developed market economies with 100 million people. It'll never work. You can't do those sorts of things. How do you respond to that? Is it possible to do this outside those Scando countries?
Well, I think this is the advantage of starting out, as we both did, saying, look, there's an economic story at the core here. So I don't explain anything here with the ethnic cohesion, which is in any case a thing of the past for the Nordic countries.
It's actually not true.
It has been true for a while. It was really rooted in very specific political conditions in the 1930s. It was before the war, actually, that they started to put together these tripartite union, employer, government collaboration. But there is a economic and purely economic story that works, that has to do with incentives. And it is that if you have to pay the low paid quite a lot, you will only do that if their labor is productive. That is an incentive for creating high productivity users of labor. You could add in that in the Nordics, there's also sort of low wages at the high end. So that encourages that is a strong incentive to hire people with skill. So that helps. But once you have that, there's no reason why you couldn't try to replicate, certainly, the high wages at the bottom end in the UK or the US. And I try to say specifically in the book, look, you don't have the sort of collaborative, wide-ranging, high-coverage unions in many countries as you have in the Nordics. They are exceptional in that. But you can try to replicate the same economic effects that those unions have. And the specific example is a high, aggressive minimum wage policy. Now, why wouldn't that work in a big country? It hasn't really been tried, to be honest. It was tried, maybe back in the 30s when the minimum wage was introduced in the US. It was pretty high for the conditions of the time. And then for decades, it was left to erode. And you start to see now a movement to push it up again. It hasn't really gone that far yet. So it's, the jury's out. But to the extent that we do see evidence, it actually seems to work.
the other angle that you push on then, and again, something that economists like to suggest is important here, is the rise of the knowledge economy. And the basic argument here is that the agglomeration effects of skills and the technological shift towards code, digital software, etc. in particular, the environment of universities around that, etc., has created growth nodes which have accelerated and concentrated these wealth effects, much to the detriment geographically of other areas. And I would be foolish to disagree with that. But I do want to push it in a little bit of a different direction, which is, but there's kind of a political economy story to this as well. I mean, if one thinks about VC money, practically all of the venture capital money goes to New York, San Francisco, Seattle, Boston, and Stockholm, of all places. If we think about private equity, it's essentially 4 or 5 cities in the US that dominate everything of the $1.5 trillion in investment. So how do we think about, and then of course there's the whole issue of when corporates are met with zero interest rates, what do? Do they invest? That would be nice. No, they do buybacks, right? All this sort of bad behavior by corps, etc., tax dodges by corporations. So there's definitely the knowledge economy. There's definitely the technology and the technological shift effect. But in a sense, I wonder about the politics of corporates and finance behaving badly, right? How does that push this in directions which harm belonging? What's their part in the drama?
Yeah, I think we need to think about, we need to have more than one thought in our heads at the same time. And there are basically two, in a sense, separate independent processes going on at the same time. One is a economic force, technological change, which means that the labor that is creating the most value added now is not at the factory floor, it's not at the assembly line, it is in creating algorithms or facilitating production processes, but sort of thinking work, if you like. That's one thing. And that happens to favor, not all else being equal, that favors the big cities, the biggest cities most. Or at least it has until, maybe now we realize we can do it all from afar. Who knows what the pandemic and the Zoom economy does to that. But that's essentially a technology story as well. In parallel, but conceptually completely separate, is a policy story, if you like. The phenomena you describe, you can kind of group them all under financialization. A finance and financial logic-driven allocation of productive capital. That's partly a result, mostly a result of policy and of course, innovation in finance too. But it's policy that has allowed this to happen, that has allowed financialization to take over a lot of management and capital allocation decisions. That conceptually is completely separate. You could have one without the other. But these two actually reinforce one another, right? If you have them both in parallel. So there's a self-reinforcing process here. Why? Well, because financialization has a tendency to extract value and link it to financial centers. And the financial centers, it will be where the financiers are. It will be the big cities. It will be New York, right? It will be London. It will be places
It's
like
also
that.
where your knowledge economy is.
It's where the knowledge economy is for technological reasons, partly. It just works better to do knowledge work in big groups. But once you have that, and you think from the perspective of a financier, if for technological reason, a knowledge company in a big city is a better bet than one out in the sticks, of course, that's where you're going to put your money, even if there wasn't this political push for it as well. And vice versa, right? Because it's easier to get finance in the cities, that's where all the tech savvies are going to go. That's where you meet your VC investors. So these things feed on one another. And that's hard to deal with. But you can find policies that try to, spread the wealth, to use a cliche. It's very hard because you have two separate but mutually reinforcing forces going against you. But that's what you're up against, and you need to think of ways to counteract.
So the two of them basically tunnel in one way.
Exactly.
But I wonder how much this then becomes a kind of tail wagging the dog phenomenon. So if I go to the BLS and look at job growth by volume, the fastest growing jobs in the US, and this has been true for several years, are elder care nurse, short order cook. I mean, these are not knowledge economy jobs, but they're the volume of jobs that's being created. Service sector, precarious, low productivity, hourly wages, no benefits. And then there's a kind of much smaller number of people involved in basically either financial rent extraction or tech, which, given the way that technology companies work, can be seen as a kind of form of rent extraction. They don't pay taxes, they have huge margins, etc., right? Is that kind of sustainable? I mean, if you have the majority of people not really living in the knowledge economy and yet the knowledge economy is what's been seen to drive the economy the way it is. Does that kind of create up a conflict between these two experiences of the economy for people?
Well, it certainly does. I mean, partly just because if inequality is high enough, you end up living such different lives that you culturally drift apart. And that's true of any kind of significant inequality. But let's, for example, think about the regional dimension. So care work will be needed everywhere because there are people everywhere. And in fact, probably it's slightly more preponderant in the left behind areas in the periphery because there'll be more sick people there, maybe more elderly people. As it is today, the jobs that produce the biggest economic surplus, and some of that is rent, I agree, but not all of it. I mean, it's clear that platforms are fantastic productivity enhancers. A lot of those will be concentrated in a geographic area, the big cities, basically. What does that mean? It means that if you happen to grow up in a small town and you have a talent for these kinds of jobs, you're smart, you can code well, that sort of thing. It'll be hard for you to find an opportunity in your hometown. You'll have to move to the city to actually use those skills. And that reinforces, again, it's a third thing that reinforces the same dynamic. So there must be, the solution must be to make it possible for some of these high surplus jobs to spread more widely, right? Make it possible to have them in more places, and ideally closer to some of these other jobs that, yes, also will be abundant and needed. And partly that is what may make it both economically but also politically possible to reward some of those jobs better. But that will certainly take, quite radical policy action.
Well, in a sense, are we sort of rediscovering the 50s? Because back in the 50s, we just called this regional policy. And that's what we did. And then there was industrial policy, and that's what we did. And then we kind of stripped all that away. And are we now coming back, even at the level of the EU, to recognizing that those types of policies are absolutely necessary if you want to address these geographic inequalities as much as these sort of, intertemporal and wealth inequalities?
Yes, with one or two qualifications, and they're very important. The other thing that was different in the 50s is that the core driver of the economy, the industrial economy, was just naturally more suited to being geographically distributed. So a small town is a pretty good scale to run a factory economy at. And that's why you could have factories in mid-sized towns and be generators of economic surplus for that local area. That is harder with the current core activities, right, that tend to the cities, as we've said. So that's another thing that's different completely apart from policy. But on policy, I agree. In the case of the EU, this has been part of the system for a long time. It just hasn't worked all that well. There's been transfers to poorer areas for a long time. But what's different, I think, is that, or at least maybe what we are rediscovering, is that it's not simply about compensating losers or subsidizing poorer areas, transferring incomes. What you really need to do is to try to transfer, if you like, productivity. You need a sort of equality and distribution of productivity. You need to ensure that those places, the poorer places, themselves actually generate economic surplus. Because it won't be sustainable, I don't think, to simply have all the productivity concentrated in a few places, even if you redistribute, right? It doesn't work on either end. Nobody's happy with that.
No, I totally get that. It's not just redistributing wealth, it's about generating wealth. I totally get that. But if you're right, in the sense that the two main drivers here are these technological and knowledge agglomeration effects, which breed regional disparities, and that ultimately the kind of the factory economy that produced lots of those so-called good jobs, whether they were good or not on a health basis is a different story, is gone, then it's going to be very difficult to basically, my hometown is Dundee, right? Dundee has started to do reasonably well because it's become a hip tourist destination. Who knew? It got Victoria and Albert's surplus stock from the museum, and they dumped it up there. And it's small enough that essentially it's hit bottom and it's come out of it and plateaued and it's found a little niche. It's not exactly an exportable story. What do you think that we can do to really produce those types of productivity plus GVA plus regions that really don't exist just now?
Yeah, I mean, it's a question with several traps, this, because it's impossible to say, well, it'll be doing this thing. It'll be tourism or it'll be advanced manufacturing. That's going to differ a lot from different places. And we just don't know what the most important activities will be 20 years from now. So that's sort of a trap we don't want to fall into. What we do want to do is to try to identify all the things that, first of all, hold these places back, because some of them can be changed. We can look at different success stories and try to, fix all of them, but fix all of them at the same time. So, let me give you an example. Another example. You mentioned Dundee, but people have written about Grand Rapids as a success story, and there are places that have been heavy industry dependent, have lost out in the way that most industrial places have, and have managed to kind of get back into a sort of advanced manufacturing hub. So you hear stories about packaging company in Grand Rapids turning to medical packaging, high value manufacturing, scientifically informed, high tech, skill intensive manufacturing. Now, how do those sort of turnaround stories happen? Well, they seem to happen when you have a combination of two things. One, at local level, you sort of see what is it we could be good at that works in today's economy. And that includes, incidentally, to be very open to globalization, to sort of have an open market, whether it's for tourists or for your manufacturing products. And secondly, enough enabling conditions where both central and local government manages to remove the obstacles. So you want to ensure that people in the local area have enough skills. You want to ensure that there's finance for companies that can actually think innovatively. And that's a big problem. In the US, since before the global financial crisis, there was a financial drought in the periphery. Yeah. People don't talk about that.
Collapse of community banks, absolutely.
So you need maybe to reinvent the community bank for the knowledge economy, right? You need, of course, infrastructure, physical infrastructure, so that people can get there and get out. You need social infrastructure, by which I mean both the sort of social capital that allows people in smaller areas or left behind areas to connect mentally and psychologically and socially with the big city hubs. So you want to know how to talk to a VC investor, for example, right? These are not obvious things. They have to be taught and trained. And you need to ensure that the place itself is attractive for people who can do these high-skilled jobs to live in. So that involves, in part, some transfer of resources, but it involves investing in cultural capital, the sort of everything from museums to swimming pools, the sort of amenities that make a place nice to live. And you need, and it's only now I come to redistribution, really, you need to ensure that there's enough local purchasing power that you can sustain the sort of local high street that people need, the sort of shops that people think are nice, and they say they think it would be nice to have. You ask people in left behind areas, what are the things they're upset about are boarded up high streets,
the
right?
shops
Or main streets, you would say in the US.
Or in the United States, it's the Walmart effect. Yeah. Walmart moves in, everything else shuts down.
And finally, you can do things to create a critical mass of these high-value knowledge jobs. So it turns out that a very good policy is to put research institutes, research universities in smaller towns. Not teaching universities, that doesn't seem to make the same difference. Proper research hubs, so that there are enough people there to create a community that will attract more of them. Now, those are 6-7 things. So all of those have to be in place, and you need local inspiration. Very hard to get, but those are the necessary conditions.
But it's not as if we don't know how to do it. That's the important thing. But it does still run back into this issue, which is, if at the end of the day, the GVA that's being produced is coming from this relatively small part of the economy and this relatively small number of people from the activities that they do, let's say that for every knowledge worker, there are 3 short order cooks and elder care nurses who are basically productivity negative, then it's really hard to sort of spread that around in a sense.
Yes and no, because remember, this was true for the industrial economy too. It was the good factory jobs that paid the most, right?
Right.
But just the fact that those jobs were geographically more distributed helped. But the other thing that helped was that piggybacking on that economic structure was a set of institutions, strong unions, and so on. So they were, partly by accident, partly by design, they really were conducive to a pretty social democratic, if you like, approach to distribution. Now, how do we replicate something like that today? Because you're right, most jobs will not be in these sectors, even if more of them could be in more places in each country. But I think that's where you need a whole set of other policies that empower the people in those jobs to basically capture more of that surplus for themselves. So I talk in the book about how
wage floors, wage compression,
etc. Also a benefit system that ensures that you're not kind of trapped in bad jobs. This is why I am, on this controversial issue of whether a universal basic income is the way forward. That's my main argument for a universal basic income, that it creates this irreducible minimum level of power for every individual, the power to say no. And you could do other things in terms of regulating work conditions and so on.
Yeah. I want to get into globalization, another interesting aspect of your book, is you're a strong defender of it. Again, I'm going to chalk this up to the Scandinavian heritage, because you've always been global in that sense. You've always been export-driven economies. And I want to get into it for two angles. Now, I've read the book, I buy the argument, but let's say that I'm just a standard person who's vaguely interested in this. I read your book and I say, Martin, come on, you can't tell me that 600 million people joining the global labour market in a little under 15 years hasn't massively depressed wages in the core and displaced huge amount of workers. But in a sense, you are saying, actually, that's not true, right?
I'm pretty much saying that's not true, because I think what would have happened instead, companies started producing in China, which is what you're referring to, the 600 million workers, because they could move, again, we talked about it, low productivity, low wage jobs to China, right? So the only way to have kept all of those jobs in the West would have been to maintain them as low productivity, low wage, relatively jobs. Of course, there was some wage arbitrage. But if you look at every Western country, the share of industrial jobs has fallen regularly since the mid-70s. The absolute number and the share of the total economy. Before China, maybe an acceleration for the US with the China shock, not so much other countries. If anything, Germany probably slowed down the reduction in industrial jobs because it could export things to China. There are two sides. And of course, a lot of the manufacturing that's produced in the world now goes to serve consumers in the emerging world, including the Chinese middle class. So there wouldn't have been as much to produce for if that globalization had never happened. But what I think would have happened would be that in the absence of an easy way to economically maintain the same production processes, but in a poorer country, companies would have had a stronger incentive to do what they always do, which is to automate, to replace workers with robots. And in fact, you can look at the Western countries that have kept the highest share of manufacturing work, Germany, Sweden, South Korea, if you count that as economically part of the West. They're also the ones that have robotized and automated a lot. So ultimately, I think if you hadn't had globalization, companies in the West would have tried to find other ways to economize on labor, unless labor had been kept cheap enough that they could keep going with these labor-intensive practices. They would only have kept a lot of people on the assembly line if they could pay them little enough. So, the choice wouldn't have looked that nice. It would either have lost all the jobs anyway, or there would have been really, really bad jobs. Now, where countries differ is what you replace those jobs with, right? So the jobs have been lost everywhere, pretty much. The US is a little bit of an outlier. But some countries have actually managed to get people into better jobs in the service sector.
No. One other thing on globalization, and this is where I put on my kind of global macro hat, which is not really part of the book. So this is a bit pushing it out there a little bit. Is globalization a moment, and has it had its moment irrespective of what we think of it as policy? And here's what I mean by this. The entire thing is really kind of predicated on the US dollar as an intermediation device. The US is 25% of global GDP, but it runs basically the deficit, which allows everybody else to have a surplus. The US isn't in very great shape just now. And in fact, the COVID recession, if it goes as bad as some of the projections have it, the US could be possibly the most affected country. And that means its share of global GDP goes down, its internal strife goes up, etc., etc. At that point in time, can you really run a kind of global system with a declining hegemon, with dodgy finances, etc., etc.? And if the US decides that it has to do something about inequality, it has to do something about these jobs, and one of the ways it does that is it abandons the notion of a strong dollar and allows a big devaluation, then the ability of everyone else to export into that deficit just declines, which then impacts their business models. So I'm wondering if you will, if the kind of monetary space globally for globalization as we knew it to be sustained is actually a shrinking possibility space. What do you think of that?
Look, I try to kind of look through what you could call the monetary veil, right? The exchange rate veil. I think it's an old-fashioned way to think of economic flows as determined by exchange rates rather than the other way around. So for me, the exchange rates are the balancing items. What's driving international macro asymmetries is basically domestic, either both individual incentives, the setups for business and political incentives, whether you save more than you invest. So the situation, if I recast the situation you're asking me to imagine, is will America stop living beyond its means and start to save more than it invests at home?
Right.
Which is the opposite of what it's doing now. And once you put it that way, it sounds a lot less likely, right?
It does.
Are they going to cut their consumption relative to their productive capacity? I mean, if what they do is to somehow manage to expand their productive capacity a lot more, a lot faster than they have, and their consumption doesn't increase by as much, well, I mean, that we'll see. But I'm not sure that would be such a bad thing for the world economy, that suddenly the US too managed to produce a lot more. The bigger thing about globalization, I think, is that the growth rates of imports and exports have increased so much, which means that our economies are much more intertwined into a global whole. And that I don't think is going to go away. And nor should it.
Fair enough. Now, just going to have to round it out because we're running out of time. I'm going to read out all the things that you think should be done, and then going to ask you two things. Is anybody going to do this? And if so, who's most likely?
Right.
And then the second one, to bring us to the current moment, particularly this fraught moment to do with racial politics in the United States in particular, but also elsewhere. What about communities that have historically not belonged, that were never part of the original settlement or bargain of belonging? How do we use these ideas and these policies that you've got at the back end of your book, and you've really worked out much more than most people have and tried to put it together as a whole sort of package? How does that matter for them? So I'm going to read out what you've got. Forget about fiscal space, it's a bad concept. Nonsense, output gaps gone. Wage compression is good. Wage floors, UBI, is good. Defeminize the service sector. Workers on boards. More collective bargaining coverage. Increase competition. Reduce monopoly rents. Major financial reform. And more equity, less debt. Net wealth taxes. Reinvest in regions and do a carbon tax. I agree with all of that. Every single last bit of it. But is there really a political party out there that kind of gets it? That these aren't just a list. This isn't just a list, right? This is a whole program. This is a politics. This is a way of restructuring the relationship between state and citizen. Do you see anybody out there in any sort of political party or formation that kind of gets that?
No, in the way you phrase it, no. But I'm glad you point out that it's not just a list, it's a program. And I try to argue in the book that actually it's easier, both economically and politically, to try and do it all at once is a big thing.
Yeah, they all hang together, absolutely.
Than do one at a time. No, but what you do see are the following things. You do see some parties that you might not have expected it from recently pick up on quite a few of these things, at least rhetorically. So I sit in London, so I have in mind Boris Johnson's government, or at least the 2-3 months after he won the election before the COVID disaster. Even a budget that was the least conservative, fiscally conservative budget from a conservative chancellor in a generation. And the whole rhetoric of leveling up, a lot of that actually goes in the direction, rhetorically at least, of what I've done. And of course, that's copying some of the populists. They've promised, if not exactly these things, many of these things. And mainstream parties, I think, are seeing they need to have an equivalent and equivalently ambitious offering. So you see Boris Johnson and his new type of Tory party talking about this. You see some politicians elsewhere seeing the need for a big shift. And here I have in mind people like Emmanuel Macron. So again, I think the political logic is starting to seep through. You see other parties saying that COVID, actually, we need to use this crisis as a moment to think big change. And I think some of them mean it. So I think there's work ongoing that's moving in that direction. No, we're not there yet. But of course, my book is only coming out now. So this will change everything.
We have to give it time to change everything. But, that big change has to matter not just to the communities that are being appealed to by, for example, right-wing populists. Yep. So to take the current moment in the US, I don't know if you saw this, there was a Boston Federal Reserve report out last week that did a calculation for net family median wealth in Boston. So assets, liabilities, netted out, the whole thing. And for white families, it was $247,000. And for black families, it was $8.
Yeah.
I mean, really, $8, not a typo, right?
Yeah.
And those types of, structural facts, if you will, suggest that particularly for African Americans, they really never were part of the economy of belonging. How do we not just heal that wound? How do we use these types of policies to make sure that we just don't do that anymore?
Yeah. No, I'm glad you're bringing this up because I haven't talked much about it. I touch on it a bit in the book, but it's true that they were never part of the economy of belonging. Although when the economy of belonging was happening, things were sort of moving in the right direction. I mean, they were, 60s were a chaotic time, but there were improvements. And to some extent, things have improved somewhat over time. Although the statistics you point out show that far from enough. And in the US, there's a particular problem with residual racist institutions in the economy. I think of the legacy of redlining, for example, that has big effects on asset distribution today, for example. But a lot of the policies I talk about, or the mistakes and the processes that have led to the end of belonging, are also those that affect marginal groups like minorities. And the things that will do things better for the people who have lost out are also things that will help those who never got a place to begin with. So let me give you two examples very quickly. I talk about shifting the tax burden to a wealth tax. I mean, that would directly address the sort of asset disparity you talked about. And of course, white wealth is much higher than black wealth, but there are a lot of white people out there without any wealth either. We want to create an economy where you can actually save up something, right? That means take taxes away from labor earnings and put them on wealth. That's one example. Another example is that we know that the cyclical economy, the boom-bust economy, hurts marginalized people much more than the average person in the economy. So both minorities, but also the low educated, also the young, they get fired first in a recession, they get hired last in the expansion. So I argue for a much more aggressive macroeconomic policy, which really tries to keep demand always a bit ahead of supply. If you can shorten the slumps and lengthen the booms, that will automatically benefit both, let's say, the white working class, but also marginalized minority communities. There are a lot of policies we can put in place that will help on all fronts. And, what are we waiting for?
Well, it seems to be, as ever, there's a lot of good ideas. We just need to get them into the heads of people who matter and get them to act on them.
They'll have to listen to your podcast.
Exactly, and they'll have to read your book, so there we go. All right, Martin, it's been a pleasure as ever. And again, for everyone, it's The Economics of Belonging, Princeton University Press. Just out, really worth a read. Great to chat to you, and hopefully see you soon.
Thank you very much.
This episode of the Rhodes Centre podcast was produced by Dan Richards. You can subscribe to us on iTunes, Stitcher, or your favourite podcast app. If you like us, rate us on iTunes, and help others find the podcast as well. For more information, go to watson.brown.edu/Rhodes. Thanks for listening.